Number 10 is the Year of Revolution. The Year of Revolution was 1848, where the spring and summer saw uprise of people of Europe demanding change in numerous countries. This was most notable in France, the states that would become Germany, Denmark, and Austria and Hungary. But in total, record shows more than 50 nations affected by unrest in that year. This led to hundreds of thousands of people's demise, whether at the hands of their own authorities, each other, disease, or riots. However, whether it was all worth the sacrifice remains the source of much historical debate. 1848 also represents the height of the Irish famine, which left hundreds of thousands dead and caused many millions to leave their homeland for good. And while the French monarchy did fall once again, in many places the old orders clung on to power by making just a few token concessions, and Europe's middle class earned a greater rep. But the heightened and touchy senses of nationalism would simmer below the surfaces for decades to come until the largest consequence of the Year of Revolution reared its ugly head: World War I. The powerful German Confederacy found its foundation in the 1848 revolutions. Number 9. The 30-Year War. This war occurred in the 17th century and is considered one of the most lethal events in colonial history. This is because if you consider the proportion of casualties to the total population of Europe at the time, it was actually even deadlier than the Black Plague or World War II. The focal point of this war was religion, as Catholics and Protestants were beefing it up all over Europe and devastating the countryside. Almost all the big powers of Europe were involved, making this conflict quite widespread. Naturally, having a bunch of countries focused on sieging one another resulted in neglect towards civilians. Poverty, disease, and famine were huge during this time, let alone what little they have being constantly pillaged and looted by mercenary units. So, while the 30-Year War doesn't get as much credit as more popular recent catastrophes in Europe, anyone who was alive and well in the time would have definitely seen some things. Number 8 is the Siege of Sarajevo. From 1992 to 1996, this is the longest siege to ever happen on a capital city in modern history. Sieges themselves are incredibly bad times to be in, and many have humanitarian disasters such as the Siege of Leningrad. This Siege of Sarajevo is a horrific example with close to 14,000 deaths recorded, but more are incredibly likely. Before fighting broke out in Bosnia and Herzegovina in April of 1992, Bosnian Serbs constructed and reinforced positions in the hills overlooking Sarajevo, believing that crushing resistance there would do the same everywhere. So when conflict ensured, they imposed a total blockade, denying Sarajevo food, power, transport, and water. Serbian forces did have better munitions, but lacked the forces necessary to storm, and the Herzegovina had the superior numbers, but lacked the munitions to storm. So it becomes a stalemate, one that lasts 4 years. Shellings destroyed markets and communities alike, and families moved into homes that still had solid structuring with other families. The tight quarters made it easier for everyone to keep warm, an added benefit as there was no fuel or supplies in many cities. With no way to leave, a once prominent city became essentially a refugee camp for its own people. Number 7 is 1958 to 1962 China. It starts with the Great Leap Forward, a campaign introduced by Communist Chairman Mao in 1958. The purpose was to modernize China's agriculture and steel production. This campaign came with a mandatory agriculture collectivization. Its policies prohibited private farming. When people are forced to stop producing for themselves, the Chinese government begins to notice perhaps their yields may not be enough. Fearful, though, of failing their superiors, instead of rectifying the issue, officials in charge exaggerated the farm yields on paper to the point that there was a food shortage. People were confused. How could so much food be documented yet none on their shelves? And it hadn't been allocated and dispersed as needed because it wasn't known. Not very communistic of the communists. This triggered the Great Chinese Famine. The death toll isn't accurately known, but is believed to be somewhere between 15 and 55 million. On top of famine deaths, civilians who had become suspicious as to what was happening and voiced up against the government resulted in 2.5 executed for suspected anti-government activity. Between famine and a government execution, it's recorded approximately 3 million people simply just made the decision to take their own lives. Number 6 is the Justinian Plague. It's considered the most devastating plague in human history, yet it's largely been forgotten. What came to be called the Justinian Plague after the Roman Empire of the time spread rapidly through most of Eastern Rome and even the Ottomans. It's said that only 60% of the recorded global population at the time were killed. We do not know how many civilizations had yet to be recorded then, so this could also be incredibly inaccurate. Anyways, in 542, the plague hit its pinnacle. As many as 5,000 people were dying per day, and a massive spike in grain and non-perishable food prices caused famine. Even Justinian himself had gotten sick, but he pulled through it and lived another decade, seeing himself how the plague lingered, which it did for another 200 years. This plague is believed to have killed 25 to 50 million people between 541 and 542, let alone the numbers killed by famine and food riots. It's also contributed to the hastened collapse of the Roman Empire. Number 5 is another plague, the Black Death. Everyone knows this one for jokes about how a single rat and a whole bunch of unsanitary people led to a mass population wipe. And it's true, it's one of the most cataclysmic plagues in human history, with anywhere between 75 to 200 million deaths. This is believed to be about 30 to 60% of Europe's recorded population, all between 1346 and 1356. Europe at the time wasn't like other countries. They hadn't advanced with medicine the way that they had, so they were even more susceptible. Not knowing the causes, prevention was pretty much impossible. People were contracting the plague easily through flea and bedbug bites. Most perished within days, a blessed relief to their misery as sores and lesions infested their bodies and rotted the skin as they vomited of blood and later their own, well, I'll just let you look it up. Entire towns were wiped out in this horrific manner, and over the next decade it ravaged large parts of Europe and then Asia as well. In the Middle East they had more medical awareness and they managed to slow the spread, but only after a third of their population perished, while in Egypt 40% of the people had died. Of course, the survivors were desperate to figure out the cause of the disease and vented their fury on anyone they could find. So both civilian mobs and church authorities upped the death counts by killing thousands of Jews, Romani, and other minorities. Number 4 is a year of no summer. It's like the opposite of 500 Days of Summer, but not a movie, and literally terrifying. Part 1. In 1815, Mount Tambora, up in present-day Indonesia, erupted in what was the most powerful volcanic eruption ever recorded. The eruption itself killed an estimated 12,000 people. Part 2. The following year, the ash cloud thrown into the sky by Tambora finally settled and devastated the global climate, leading to crop failures and famine in certain sectors of the Earth. It was essentially a snow age, caused by the ash and the dust thrown into the atmosphere, which reflected sunlight and caused global temperatures to plummet. In Europe, the winter of 1816 was so bad that snow fell in August, and people were reported to freeze and crops withered, leading to widespread starvation. In China and India, droughts, floods, and diseases killed potentially millions of people. In Europe, crops withered across the continent, leading to widespread starvation. Meanwhile, in the US, a dry fog descended across large parts of the country. New England was hit particularly hard. Temperatures plummeted, and farmers reported their crops dying in the field. An estimated 200,000 people lost their lives due to these conditions in 1816. Number 3 is American colonialization. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in America, and not only did it mark colonization of America, but it saw practically all indigenous cultures that were once rich and complex repressed and wiped out, reimagined in history to be simple or savage. The times of American colonization decimated indigenous population. Between smallpox and the action of colonizers, we see between a 60 and 90% of our population slaughtered. Once having populations over 100 million, we were rendered down to a mere few thousand. This was a genocide that is long perpetuated by the acts of endless massacre, enslavements, residential schools, the 60 Scoop, the Trail of Tears, and so many other government initiatives to erase a whole culture. As a proportion of the global population, this was the single biggest reduction of a human population in history to date, as it made up to close of 10% of all people living on the world at the time. In comparison, the second most devastating event is World War II, and it only reduced the population by 3%. The decimation of indigenous populations of North America was so huge it changed global weather patterns and caused a dip in temperatures around the world by the beginning of the 17th century. But don't forget, Columbus and the colonial movement started kidnapping Africans at this time as well and bringing them over. Stolen people are brought to stolen lands, and millions of Africans die during their transportation or due to uprisings and exposure to foreign illnesses the way the indigenous had. Number 2 is ironically number 1, the year 536 dark cloud. What I mean by this is scientists have actually determined the worst time to be alive. No estimates, no guesses. It's for a fact the year 536. I mentioned this in our True Stories from the Dark Ages video, so it may be familiar to you. During 536, a mysterious fog rested over Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, causing a day and night darkness that lasted 18 months. Temperatures that summer fell between 34.7 Fahrenheit to 36.5 Fahrenheit, initiating the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years. Snow fell that summer in China, and the Irish Chronicles record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Crops failed universally. Meat was rare without sun for plants. Many animals starved, as did people. They also perished from cold, cannibalism, and a few other nasty conditions. This discovery was actually made from tree ring studies in the 1990s, suggesting summers around the year 536 to 540 were unusually cold. Researchers hunted for a cause, and the Change Institute of University of Maine figured it out. Their team recovered that a cataclysmic volcano eruption in Iceland spewed ash across the northern hemisphere in early 536. Two other massive eruptions followed in 540 and 547. Between the initial eruptions and the ones that followed, instead of just a year of no summer, they got many months of winter and darkness. So how is the proven worst time to be alive coming in second? Because the Toba catastrophe is number one. It happened somewhere between 70 to 75,000 years ago, and we know very little about it aside from the fact it was a supervolcanic eruption whose ash cloud didn't just cover a few countries, it covered the world. This wasn't just darkness and cold, this was smog and smoke and ash covering the ground alongside the snow. The explosion and pollution, famine, and disease it caused reduced the global population of humans by 60 to 90%. That's right, up to 90%. Scientists have estimated that the event meant that only as few as 3,000 to 10,000 humans were left. And when you consider that animal populations have to drop to 2,500 for us to consider them endangered, there was a time when our species got very close. For reference, over 10,000 people die per day now. Scientists figured out this happened by looking at the Toba ash deposits found worldwide and the genetic diversity of the people living today. They already knew that there was a bottleneck somewhere in history, so they compared this genealogy to our current genetic diversity and they found significant differences. They found the bottleneck and the proof we nearly had gone extinct. It's pretty insane that our current population of 7 billion people are all descendants of only 3 to 10,000 people. Imagine the genetic diversity had all those people survived.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have heresy. Okay, I can admit when I'm wrong, and in the last video last week, I messed up. I said the wrong word when talking about spoiled queens. You guys pointed it out. Yeah, I read your comments, okay? And now we're here to redeem ourselves. I'm learning, you're already smart, let's get into it. In medieval times, it could be dangerous to disagree. Nowadays, many people like to keep an open mind. There's so many cultures, beliefs, people think different things, and that is totally okay. But it absolutely was not okay in the Dark Ages. Oh no. In these times, if you held any kind of belief that could go against the teaching of the Christian church, you were seen as a heretic. Many leaders, whether kings or crusaders or even missionaries and merchants, especially from the late 11th century, fought to have Christianity take over in the Mediterranean world. People belonging to other faiths, such as Jewish and Muslim people, suffered persecution and expulsion. In England, there were massacres, and in the late 12th century, Edward I banned all Jewish people from England. I mean, this quite literally set the stage for the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, which was aimed at establishing Spain as a united single Christian faith. Wars in medieval Europe weren't just waged on people of different faiths, however, it was also aimed at some Christians who people believed to be heretics. This is all to say that heresy was a serious crime in these times, and thinking outside of what you were told to think at the time and what was accepted could have landed you a death sentence.
Number 9. Facial expressions. I can't grow facial hair. I'm not sure if you noticed that watching, but it's never happened. It's not gonna happen. Quite frankly, I don't have to worry about trimming a beard early in the morning, anything like that, which is fine, to be honest with you. I'm not really complaining. Back in the medieval ages, I would have been set. People would have been pretty, I don't know, would have been more than ideal. The no hair look was the way to do it. The forehead was seen as the central point of your face, so it was common back in the medieval times for individuals to pluck all of their eyelashes and remove their eyebrows completely. So people would just be looking at you like, nothing going on, no facial expressions, just bald everything. Many would go as far as to pluck their hairline back even further so they have the round, oval, queen bald look. Imagine that. Imagine everyone's bald in Game of Thrones. Think it'd still get the rankings that it does? Probably not. Probably not. Macy Williams is just...
In our number 8 spot today, we have Animal Court. The history of animals being put on trial goes back pretty far, as it is believed it has roots in ancient Athens, but it was definitely a common practice as recently as the 18th century. Courts would go after things like rats, weevils, flies, locusts, and serpents for damaging crops, and when punished, they weren't just liable for damages, they could be banished and excommunicated. Like, imagine trying to banish a fly. This isn't where it ends though. In civil criminal court, they'd have livestock being tried for violence against humans. Like, I'm sorry, Your Honor, my client could not tell the prosecution that she didn't want to be milked because she's a cow. Kicking was the only way. As an example of a real animal court case, let's take it back to 1457 France. Villagers in a town witnessed a sow and her 6 piglets attack and kill someone. Terrible story, sounds absolutely horrifying to have to witness. In this day and age, animal control would be called and all of those pigs would likely put down. But not in these times. When this happened, all the pigs were sent to court. Like real court. There was a judge, 2 prosecutors, 8 witnesses, and a defense attorney for the accused animals. Witnesses provided testimony that proved that the sow had most definitely attacked the person and was definitely responsible for the crime. The piglets, however, well, for them, testimony was a bit murkier. There wasn't a witness who actually saw any of the piglets do any actual attacking. They just had blood on them, which isn't necessarily a sign of their guilt, it just means that they were there. This is why the court, while they did sentence the sow to death, the piglets were exonerated for their role in the crime. It's very strange and now would be a very expensive system, but in those times it really did work for them.
Number 7. Inns and taverns. When we think of a medieval tavern or an inn, it's important to note the difference. Yes, there's drinking in both, and yes, both of them don't smell so great. But inns, their sole purpose was to house travelers comfortably, whereas a tavern, not so much housing, more rough housing, if anything, if you catch my drift. Say you're passing by one of these taverns, right, Saturday night, you feel like grabbing some questionable ale from some questionable establishment, well, you better come prepared. In the Middle Ages, you had to bring your own fork everywhere you went. Just one fork on your side, on your persons. That's so gross. We didn't have a guy sitting in booth 11 doing roll-ups all night, looking at you, just wishing that he didn't work there, right? This was the Middle Ages. You didn't have a fork. No one had forks. If you had a fork, you were lucky, right? You were the rich kid on the block with an in-ground pool. That was you if you had a fork. Steak knives also were only reserved for carvers, so until the 17th century, you were just poking around your meal until you had a bite-sized amount, and then you would choke on it because it's horrible. It's all chewy and horrible.
In our number 6 spot today, we have the Filth. If you lived in a city during this time in history, it would have been an absolutely filthy place to be. I mean, human and rats lived in harmony. Not harmony, the plague, but things were so dirty rats were everywhere. Want to go swimming in the nice stream nearby? Well, good luck, because not only is that body of water used for dumping sewage, but it's also for the village's water supply to both drink and bathe in. Disease was plentiful, obviously, and it spread exceptionally quickly. Spreading disease was even easier considering how all of the homes were packed full of people and no one really knew anything about hygiene and the benefits yet, health and otherwise. If you were to go out in the evening, especially at past curfew, it was also an insanely huge risk. Going out ran you the risk of getting killed or robbed with no police on the streets to help protect you at all. While city living provided a bit of safety in numbers situation compared to the countryside and also provided more opportunities to make money, it was still quite a risky place to live during the Dark Ages.
Number 5. Teethworms. Awesome. You have any cavities? Now you're going to be looking this whole video. Dentists weren't common back in the Dark Ages, but they did have a barber. So I guess we're good for a few hundred years. This guy did it all. Cavities, toothaches, teeth worms, gross, you name it, he'll pull it out violently. Barbers were responsible for cutting hair, pulling teeth, bloodletting. Your classic 3-in-1 appointment right there, really, all in 10 minutes or less. Instead of brushing with tooth tunes, back then you would rub your teeth and gums with a rough linen. Yeah, just grab an old shirt. It's an old dirty shirt we're gonna brush up for school. Like you're playing a harmonica, only dirty shirt. A few recipes have been discovered since for pastes and powders to freshen their breath back then, you know. Otherwise, you were pretty screwed. You had nothing. We went from powdered charcoal to charcoal toothpaste all over again. What a weird loop we did. Mouthwashes were also made from herbs and spices steeped in wine or vinegar, so fresh breath guaranteed, no doubt about it.
In our number 4 spot today, we have the stripes ban. We've all met someone before who seems to be concerned with what other people are wearing, and we jokingly refer to them as the fashion police. But back in the Dark Ages, you might come across some very real fashion police who are actually interested in fining you, should your finest tunic not be of the local dress code. Sometimes it wasn't even just a fine. Some serious fashion faux pas could lead to your imprisonment or even your death. Stripes were definitely a main culprit in these times, as striped clothing was seen as a garment of the devil. I'm not even exaggerating either. In the year 1310 in a French town, there was a local cobbler who was put to death because he had been caught in striped clothes. Yeah, we thought the tabloids were harsh, and I mean, they are, but the medieval fashion police were unforgiving. Not only were members of clergy not exempt from this rule, but neither were animals. Yeah, calling all zebras. Good luck out there, man. This is why zebras were called beasts of the devil, and yes, this is even though the people of Europe hadn't even seen them. Just heard tales of their striped nature.
Number 3. No rules football. In honor of the World Cup coming to a close, we have to take a look at football back in the late 12th century. Yeah, what did that look like? Or feel like, rather. Instead of corner kicks and throw-ins, you could do anything you wanted to retrieve the ball from the opposing team. Yeah, anything. Left hooks, some kicks, some jabs, throwing rocks, anything, you name it. It was violent. No diving in these games, I'll tell you that for free. You didn't have to. There was also no time limit. There was also no limit to how many players could be involved. So choose your team wisely. Pick the biggest guy, pretty much. It's town versus town a lot of the time. There's a lot of emotions out there settled on the field. And in the middle of it somewhere, there would be a soccer ball rolling around. I would call this a sport. Now finally, come 1314, King Edward II banned the game. And yeah, more than fair. All his civilians and citizens are dying. He's like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe it's not wise. I don't know.
In our number 2 spot today, we have fast medieval marriage. There are so many messed up medieval marriage practices. We could do an entire video on just that. And in fact, we have. Go check those out. But while you're here, let's talk just a bit about them. Marriage in the medieval times was quick and easy, but also difficult to prove. If you and your loved one wanted to get married, all you really needed to do was say, "We're married!" and then boom, it's done. Of course, this led to a whole pile of those spur-of-the-moment type marriages, especially considering how sex before marriage was widely condemned in these times. You know, people are like, we're married now, let's do it. Well, I'm pretty sure many people who were divorced would have preferred if their marriages were this easy. This led to people, of course, taking advantage of this difficult to prove thing. Most especially women would often fall victim to a man who might want to take you as his wife for the night. But then the following day, after getting what he wants, he denied ever agreeing to the union of the two, if you're catching my drift. This is why many women tried to get at least one witness to union, just in case.
And finally, number 1. Pointed shoes. This one's so fun. Whenever I see anything that's related to the medieval times, I always admire the attire, right? Especially the shoes. I hate buying shoes today so much. Now they're so specific. You got walking, running, trail shoes. They're always so expensive. Nobody does it like the medieval times anymore. Specifically, krakows. Krakows were awesome. They were the style of shoe commonly worn in the 15th century Europe that looked really ridiculous. They had the huge long nose that went up really high. They're so silly looking, maybe that's why I love them. These long-toed shoes first appeared in the 12th century, but the krakow, the thing is, these things were twice as long as your foot, and that was considered fancy back then. These meant business, so you better watch those ankles, Beth, alright? We're going into some meetings fast. They were named after the city that they were made in. Krakows were worn by everybody at one point, but as cheeky as it sounds, the longer the shoe, the more valuable you were. There we go. So it turned into a joke eventually, right? These things got way too long and it looked ridiculous. You ever walk around in flippers beside the pool where you do that big silly walk? That's the walk that everybody was doing in town, right? It was out of hand. They would be stuffed with horsehair or moss. Yeah, which is just as comfortable as Dr. Scholl's. Imagine stepping around in moss all day. Yuck. Also, sometimes a string would be needed to be tied from the tip of the shoe to your knee just to keep these damn things afloat. So everybody at one point in time in the medieval times looked like a Muppet tied to strings. How amazing is that? Do you own any krakows? If so, how do we get our hands on a pair? I'm a size 11.5 krakow. Let's make it happen. Maybe if we all pitch in as a community, I don't know, we can all be wearing krakows tomorrow.
Number 10, let's start out setting the scene. So rather than rank the least to worst aspects of this year, let's set the scene of how this became the worst year. Prior to 536, the early 500s were in some pretty heavy transitions. The Western Roman Empire had fallen to German invaders, and the Eastern sect would soon follow suit. The Middle East was divided between the Byzantine and the Persian empires. China's influence continued to spread through East Asia, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Even though it was experiencing a weak point, China was divided into both North and South territories, and they were constantly at odds with each other. Africa, however, was developing trade routes through the Sahara, and a powerful new kingdom was arising in Ethiopia. They wouldn't be heavily affected by this, but part of them would be. Peasants throughout Europe were used to the tradition of harvest seasons being reliable until one day all this movement and all this growth stopped. Number 9. Climate impact. This period of ominous and unexplained darkness led to serious negative transformations. A Roman politician by the name of Cassiodorus wrote that the sun looks bluish and that the moon had no luster. The seasons also seemed to be jumbled together into one. No summer, no spring, just a long, ever gloomy middle winter kind of thing. Another eerie fact he added was, and I quote, "We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon," unquote. The dark sunless days brought periods of cold, with temperatures falling as low as 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius all year round, making it the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years. This is the closest the world got to the winter depicted in Game of Thrones, besides the actual Ice Age of course. This was called the mini antique Ice Age. Now why did this happen? Here we are at number 8, eruption. Now what on earth could have caused such a mysterious cloud of depression to seize the land? Well, after centuries of mystery, scientists have finally discovered what happened. It was a massive volcanic eruption that took place in Iceland. A professor of medieval history at Harvard University, Michael McCormick, led a study of a Swiss glacier which led to the discovery. Evidence of volcanic matter in the glacier proved that it was indeed a massive eruption that caused it. The ash from the eruption likely led to a fog that caused an 18-month period of darkness. It was so vast it spread across all of Europe, the Middle East, and portions of Asia. Number 7. The mist. A mysterious mist rolled in over Europe, clouding the sky in darkness. With the mist, a century of darkness would fall. Literally sounds like the setting of a Stephen King novel. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote about a portent that took place that year and said this, and I quote, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear nor such as it accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death. The sun was eclipsed for 18 months. For 3 hours in the morning it would give light, but a light that resembled neither day nor night." Unquote. Other sources describe a cloud or dust veil that darkened the sky. Number 6. Starvation. But with the extreme cold, lack of sunlight, and seasons, crop failure destroyed many lives. Farmers no longer could look forward to a bountiful harvest in the fall, as basically nothing survived. The Irish chronicles show that they had a failure of bread of all things, from the years 536 to 539. Europe, parts of Asia, and the Middle East experienced a massive famine crisis. When did things get back to normal? Well, it took over a century for things to really start to turn back. Eventually grit fell from the sky and slightly warmer temperatures returned, allowing for some crops to return. But the people had no way of knowing when that was going to happen. They just had to keep slugging along every day, watching their friends and families slowly die of starvation. Not a good time to be alive. Number 5. The Plague of Justinian. But things weren't about to get any better anytime soon. It wasn't just crop failure and famine they had to worry about. Soon, the bubonic plague was upon them. A couple years later, in 541, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, adding more woe to misery. It became known as the Plague of Justinian as it swept through the Roman port of Pelusium, Egypt, causing the deaths of half the Eastern Roman Empire's population. This in turn, according to, once again, Michael McCormick, sped up the final demise of the once great empire. The plague struck Asia, North Africa, Arabia, and Europe, taking the lives of a colossal 30 to 50 million people. And now there weren't that many people back then, so this would have really made a dent. The same disease would return centuries later and would be known as the Black Death. The reason it was called the Plague of Justinian this time around was due to the poor response from the Byzantine ruler. He was unable to complete the projects he had started due to the farmers and workers dying by the thousands, so he decided to raise taxes and change the tax code. He not only demanded taxes from the people still alive, but demanded they pay the ones owed by their fallen neighbors as well. So not a good time. Number 4. Some benefits. There were some. Now, though scientists like to say this is the worst time to be alive in history, it depends where you were and it depends where you live. I mean, I keep thinking that maybe World War II was probably worse, or World War I, I just don't know. But it was just such a long extended period of time. If you lived in the Arabian Peninsula, however, you may have actually been kind of grateful for it, you know? Due to the catastrophe, their weather changed for the good. They actually experienced more rainfall. This helped their crop and vegetation thrive. They had so much left over, they could give more to their camels. As a result, they were able to build larger camel herds to help facilitate transport for Arab armies, aiding in conquests during that century. It also may have influenced agricultural development in Estonia with their production of rye. In Finland, hunting and fishing were their main sources of livelihood, so the lack of land production didn't really bother them. They were like, okay, cool, I've got this reindeer. Number 3, snow in China. China, on the other hand, was freaking the heck out. It snowed in the summer. In the summer! I cannot imagine like a more depressing thing to happen, okay? I really can't. I mean, I remember one time in May, it snowed after like 2 weeks of just like beautiful weather, and it snowed again after the longest winter. It was the most depressing moment of my life. Anyways, in some parts of China, the weather was so bad that 70 to 80% of the population starved to death. So on top of the famine, it was the weather and all this stuff. Despite this event though, South China seemingly remained peaceful and prosperous under the Liang dynasty, which lasted from 502 to 49. However, economic pressures and internal strife within the Northern Wei Empire continued to cause trouble. The Northern Zhao was finally defeated in 581, and the South asserted control over the North. This led to the final linking of North and South China when Emperor Wen began construction of a canal system connecting the two parts of China together. Number 2, economic downturn. So obviously, with the fact that agricultural production was way down, workers were dying left, right, and center, an economic downturn soon followed the wave of plague and the mist. As previously mentioned, rulers such as Justinian raised taxes like crazy, burying his empire in debt. But just how bad did it get? Well, the study of seeds found in excavations tell a pretty bleak story. They found a high number of grape seeds in the ancient trash mounds. So what does that matter? Well, by going through each seed individually, that's dedication, they noticed a steep rise in the amount they found, and then all of a sudden a steep decline of grape pips. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, was pretty well known for their sweet wine that they sold, and they had connections with other parts of Europe that they sold it to, which means the steep decline in the seeds indicates that their economic ties took a huge hit. And last but not least, let's tie this whole thing together with survival. So how in the heck did we survive this thing? It was one foul hit after another. Bad weather, famine, plague, economic downturn, war, people being the worst. Well, a lot of it just had to play out on its own. The plague eventually died down, the planet started to slowly warm up, and along with those changes, the economy started to recover, though it would take over a century for it to actually be effective again. In the mid-7th century, Europeans began melting silver from lead ore, which led to the merchant class for the first time. This was a huge step. The Byzantines dedicated themselves to the preservation of history, and even though Justinian was the worst financially at the time, the critical reform he made regarding the legal system and those pesky construction projects set them on the right path for the future.
Number 10, famine. So related to the last point, in a time in history where there's no industrial agricultural sector, greenhouses, and those grow lights that you're totally not growing the devil's lettuce with in your basement. Yep, that's right, I know about it. Nice try, I know. Growing food can be difficult. Weather, pests, disease, harvesting a full crop is both rewarding and difficult. Well, since the dust cloud had blocked out the sun for 18 months, that meant the crops were not reaching their full fruiting potential. This cloud of dust again most likely came from volcanic eruptions and is speculated to have even dropped the temperature a few degrees. God, that sounds awful. Number 9, the dust. In the year 536, apparently a large cloud of dust and or fog covered up the sun for 18 months in Europe. Naturally, back then there could have been 1,000 reasons why this could happen, or at least that's what people thought. A quote from the wise Procopius describes the event as follows: "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear, nor as it is accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened to men, were free, neither from war nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death." Ooh, wow, that sounds bad. was bad. Our best guess is that there was a lot of volcanic activity at the time, and it could have covered parts of Europe, which is so awful, I can't even, and you'll see why. Number 8, the plague. Man, this is really shaping up to be the worst year ever. We thought 2020 was bad. Also in the year 536, there was a terrible plague, known as the Justinian Flag, or really, it's the Black Plague, but it's first round of it. As if having the sky filled with smoke and no food wasn't worse enough, people were dropping left, right, and center. Literally, they couldn't keep up with the body count, apparently reaching thousands within days. That's bad. You don't like, that's not good. You don't want that. There were so many bodies that it began to stink up Constantinople. The bodies were thrown into the sea, but they kept resurfacing, which, God, that's so gross. I can't even, I'm gonna be sick. So Emperor Justinian ordered the bodies removed from the city, which oftentimes led to the body carriers themselves succumbing to the disease. Too bad they're years away from some Purell and a mask. You know, just some good old something to sanitize the hands with, you know? Jeez. Number 7, winter. Canada. Winter, snow. For about 7 to 8 months out of the year in this country, it is cold, snowy, and cold weather. Right, Chris? Oh, yeah. Mind you, we do get nice summers here, it's just a little bit of a trade-off. So when it snows here, even in May, it's not that much of a surprise. However, when it does snow in places like Texas, we tend to take notice. This was the case in 536 China and in places in Mesopotamia, where during the summer months, there were reports of snow, which is really bad, especially if you're trying to grow food. I mean, there's no snow shovels, no plows, and no Timmies. Canadians, how would we even function without a double-double on a cold, miserable morning? All Canuck jokes aside, it was quite devastating to the regions and just adds more to what really must be the worst year ever. Number 6. Time to get oot. I am many things. Canadian, moderately funny, and a second-rate John Candy or Chris Farley. I love them both, but it depends where you're from. If you're Canadian, it's John Candy. If you're American, it's probably Chris Farley. What I'm not is a quitter. I'm a soldier, a fighter, a trooper, and I hustle my bustle, partner. I'm not shy to turn away from a challenge, and I strive to figure it out. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not afraid to throw in the towel. Sometimes you gotta know when to pull back, reassess, and most importantly, come back. If you come back, you never really quit, did you? If you come back, you're good. Take for an example some towns in central and eastern Sweden during 536 who abandoned their towns. No one is really sure why, but these towns were abandoned, obviously. Not that it's easy to run a town, because trust me, I play city builders, I would know, but it's speculated that already cool temperatures could have been made worse by the volcanic ash that covered the sky. Ooh, yeah, you wouldn't want cold temperatures getting worse back then. Bad for you. Number 5, hysteria. Okay, so what's the first thing people are gonna do when the skies turn to ash and crops perish and it's cold? What will we do? Band together and fight through the elements as humans because we are stronger together? Big prank! No, we panicked and had mass hysteria. And it was our fault and God was punishing us for our sins. Or at least one story from Egypt, that's how the story goes. Sure, I guess this is all bad luck, and it would seem like divine intervention to people back then, especially with the sky being so dark for so long. That does seem like something God would do. And if you think we still don't do that, well, wind the clock back 2 years ago, my friends. Remember when toilet paper was running low? That, my friends, is textbook hysteria. But then again, you know, having a dark cloud in the sky is alright, but there'd be a lot of dark clouds in your pants, you know what I'm saying? You wish you got toilet paper, you know what I'm saying? Number 4, more volcanoes. What's worse than having a volcano cause all these issues? More volcano eruptions, yeah, let's go! Yep, again, no one is sure if there was a specific one that was causing all the issues, but evidence in Iceland suggests that there were at least 2 volcanic eruptions. There's other evidence that suggests it could have been all the way in El Salvador and even North America. A lot of folks just don't realize how catastrophic volcanoes can be, but if you ask somebody in Pompeii, they would tell you. These extra eruptions plunged the earth into what is sometimes called the tiny ice age, as temperatures severely dropped. Well, a couple degrees can make a big difference. It sounds bad, but a couple degrees can. All I'm gonna say is that comedy comes in threes. I'm surprised there wasn't a 3rd eruption. Why is the ground shaking? Number 3, Romulus Follis. 536. This awful, no good, very bad year likely sealed the fate of the Roman Empire. For a while, she had been in decline, and her capital had already moved east. But like a lot of washed up sober music stars of the 80s, it was time for one more tour. One last hurrah to capture glory in a bottle. Well, go ahead and look at the map of Europe right now. I'll give you a second. Go ahead, sure, look at it. You see that? Yeah, there's no Roman Empire, is there? No. That's because the year 536 was full of disease, war, and uprisings. Pesky uprisings. Ugh, those are the worst. How's a dictator supposed to rule without those? Come on. In the year 541, an estimated 30% of the Byzantine Empire had perished from the plague. That's not good. You gotta have the population there. That's bad. Number 2, Moche trouble. The Moche were a civilization in what is now Peru. That's right, there were troubles back there too. It's not all just Europe. They were extremely dominant of that area, masters of irrigation and fishermen. They made their food stockpiles big, and they were a force to be reckoned with. Had a pretty decent economy too. Well, due to some weather changes in the area, the water temperature rose. Too much. The fish that the Moche relied on for food and economy were now gone. And when you're a single industry empire and that industry goes away, well, it's gonna hurt. This led to massive starvation in the Moche. Funny enough, all this climate change in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, I know we're jumping all over the place here, but it was good. The climate was okay. They saw more rainfall, allowing for better crops, which allowed them to bring more camels. More camels means more soldiers. More soldiers means more conquering. It's crazy how it works like that. So I guess it just depends where you live. Number 1, economy and survival. All of this makes you wonder how we survived this. I honestly, I'm not sure. Truth be told, it was a matter of just letting it run its course. Sometimes that's the best. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to talk about it today. Something I find interesting, however, was during all of this, Emperor Justinian tried to raise taxes to aid in the economic downfall they were feeling. Hey, nobody likes taxes being raised, unless the government was gonna make a public beer fountain. I feel like we'd all like that. I feel like everybody'd be okay with that. Yeah, I think so. Between the fog, the plague, the starvation, and the higher taxes that kind of ruined everything, well, I guess we have roads now, right? That's kind of cool. Roads are pretty sweet, right? I guess so. Just a bad time. Stay at 536. Time travelers, stay at 536. You don't want to go there. Anyway, stay at 2022 if you know what I'm saying. You don't want to be here for that.
Coming in at number 10, we have Aleppo. The 1138 Aleppo earthquake was one of the deadliest earthquakes in history. Its name was taken from the city of Aleppo in North Syria, where the most devastation occurred. The quake happened on October 11th, 1138, just one day after a smaller quake the day before. Like back-to-back violence. Due to the amount of earthquakes, the reputation of this blow is seen as the 3rd deadliest quake ever. Took around 250,000 lives with a seismic magnitude scale of 7.1. The region sits on a triple junction between the Arabian, African, and Eurasian tectonic plates, which makes this place one of the most active in the world. Just 3 different plates stuffed beside each other like a long backseat drive. Just move. You move. Mom, move. Get out of the way. Number 9. Antioch. The Antioch earthquake occurred on December 13th, 115 AD, with an estimated magnitude of 7.5 on the surface wave magnitude scale. Antioch and surrounding areas were devastated with an absolute nightmare when the violent shakes triggered a local tsunami that damaged half the sea shelf. Gnarly. Antioch at the time crowded with soldiers and civilians from all around the world. Whole trees were thrown up into the air, huge structures collapsed, massive numbers of people perished from debris or even being trapped. The aftershocks followed the days and even continued to wreak havoc. Antioch was beautiful. These were Greek and Roman designers. It was nicknamed the cradle of Christianity from its longevity until then, and the role it played in the emergence of both the Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity. Toll of destruction is about 250,000 gone. All those beautiful structures too. 50 years sanding a Corinthian column for 4 seconds of rubble. That would be heartbreaking. There it goes, huh? Okay. Number 8. The first plague. Yersinia pestis. The plague of Justinian, or the Justinianic plague, 541 to 549 AD. This was the first major outbreak plague pandemic. Fun fact, this is the same stuff that came back for the Black Death. The first old world pandemic of plagues. The OG. The disease decimated the entire Mediterranean basin, Europe, the East, and the Byzantine Empire, just named after Justinian I, who, according to historians, got the disease and then beat it during its peak nastiness. Guy got it and toughed it out. Nothing's tougher than a leader just like taping it up, you know? Just band-aiding it. This thing was nasty. It killed about 1/5 of the imperial population. It spread all through Europe, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Huge part in the fall of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, back then, no masks yet. No plague doctors, just neighbors coughing non-stop and a lot of anxiety. Number 7. Gan Earthquake. The 856 Gan Earthquake occurred on December 22nd, 856. The quake had an estimated magnitude of 7.9 and the maximum intensity of X on the Mercalli scale. Ooh, we're climbing, it's getting up there. The mesoseismal area was about 350 kilometers along the southeast Alborz Mountains, which is modern-day Iran. It caused around 200,000 deaths and is listed by the USGS as the 6th deadliest earthquake in recorded history. I'm not gonna lie, earthquakes are my new unlocked fear. It's no longer spiders. Spiders are out of the question, it's earthquakes. Holy shoot, dude, these are like the worst of the worst. So unnecessarily loud too? Like on average, it's about 60 seconds of violent shaking and debris. Every year there's about one of these in size, somewhere around the world. Every year, so incredibly loud. Number 6. The Mayan Drought. Between 760 and 930 AD, millions of Maya disappeared from the earth. No, it wasn't all the impossibly carved astronaut pictures and knowledge of our entire solar system. But somehow, something huge had wiped out the entire population. Due to its geography and lush environment, scientists have been scratching their heads for millennia. But recent LiDAR and thermal scans have concluded that it may have been nothing at all. Literally, a giant nothing. Or a drought. Yeah, it just dried up. Like my mouth right now. Sorry, I'm gonna get a drink after this. Scientists noticed changes in the environment in which the Maya lived, and the ice core evidence from Greenland indicates that around the time of the Maya collapse, a long-term drought appeared roughly from 760 to 930 in the Kari-Ako Basin. Bullseye. Dude, they gotta worry about aliens, floods, and drying up at the same time? I'm officially done complaining about the subway system. No, I'm serious, I'm done. Number 5. Manoa And Eruption. The Manoa And Eruption was an abysmal volcanic eruption that devastated the Aegean islands of Thera, aka Santorini, around 1600 BCE. It destroyed the Minoan settlements, communities, and agricultural areas on almost every nearby island. The eruption was one of the largest volcanic events on Earth in human history. Tephra, which is airborne pyroclastic material ejected during a volcanic eruption, gives us clues about the exact date and has been aggressively debated amongst archaeologists and volcanologists for decades. Plumes of volcanic lightning blacked out the skies that led to a number of blacked out summers, resulting in just one long, freezing volcanic winter. Yikes. Canadians are like, yeah, I don't get it. It's like January. Number 4. Crete 365. Sounds like a sick techno band, doesn't it? Crete in 365 was a terrifying sight. The underwater earthquake, which is believed to have been a magnitude 8 or higher, destroyed nearly every town, city, and settlement in the eastern and southern Mediterranean, spanning from Greece to Africa and even Spain. Mother Crete. Yeah, this was a big one. Archaeologists have conducted numerous excavations that prove that most towns and cities in the area were destroyed around the time of the earthquake, which has likely occurred the morning of July 21st, 365. Geologists and seismologists believe that the center eye of the quake was off the coast of Crete, hence the name, and studies have shown that may have been the result of a reaction of all the tectonic plates at the same time. Dude, this is like Transformers stuff. The horrifying part was the tsunami. Just a skyscraper high in every direction. Yeah, you know surfers are listening to this right now are like, just saying man, I coulda, you know what I mean? I'm just saying I coulda, man, I really coulda, you know? Number 3. Genesis. Speaking of waves and great bands, the Great Genesis Flood Narrative, chapters 6 to 9, the book of Genesis, good stuff, speaks of the universal flood myth, God's decision to return the universe to its pre-creation state of watery chaos and remake it through the biology and evolution of Noah's Ark. You know the story, we know this. You know, the zebras and lions and stuff. Composed somewhere around the 4th century, the global flood is supposedly a myth. Or is it? The Younger Dryas flood theory, or the late glacial interstadial, suggests that there may have actually been a sudden flood caused by an impact of some sort, resulting in the Earth experiencing a tidal wave of the century. An impact event presumed to have occurred in North America about 13,000 years ago. Huh. Although young in theory, and still being dissected by scientists today, the Younger Dryas impact theory gives way to literally every culture's telling of a celestial flood rebirthing the planet. What do you think? Arctic animals found in the rainforest, jungle cats found in the ice? Something's fishy here. Number 2. Vesuvius. In the autumn of 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius violently spewed a deadly cloud of superheated rock and gas into the sky 33 kilometers high at 1.5 million tons per second, releasing 100,000 times the thermal energy of the atomic weapons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A key part to the fall of the Roman Empire. Cities were obliterated and buried under ash and rock, famously remembered being Pompeii and Herculaneum. Now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Vesuvius National Park left behind archaeologists a gold mine. The cities were never rebuilt and almost completely forgotten about until the 18th century, where the two long-lost cities were rediscovered and excavated. There's still got to be more cities just laying there undiscovered, right? Atlantis? Where's that at? Number 1. Shaanxi. Okay, this last one I'm cheating a little bit with the time period, but I think it deserves the respect due to the destruction alone. The 1556 Shanghai Earthquake occurred in the middle of the night, January 23, 1556, in Shaanxi, China during the Ming Dynasty. Most of the residents that lived there lived in yaodongs, which were mostly underground and low-access caves carved out of the rock and mountains. With the city sleeping in the middle of the night, the Earth's most devastating earthquake was just brewing. The magnitude of the quake was approximately 8 to 8.3. Yeah, that's massive. An absolutely huge 8.3 tremor. We still don't know how many exactly, but somewhere between 100,000 and a million lives were lost from the eruption, the climate, the famine, and the tsunamis it brought with it. Yeah, this is literally the worst of the worst. Ever.
Number 10, facial expressions experiment. Okay, here's a wild one. We're gonna get dark right off the bat, immediately changing up the vibe. The facial expressions experiment was no good. Back in 1924, a psychologist with the University of Minnesota, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little bit silly. More specifically though, he wanted to see if everybody's expressions of emotions were the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone? Does sadness look the same? What about fear? What about shock? What about disgust or anger or even pain? Yeah, so he recruited some volunteers, didn't tell them all the details from campus, and then he painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He wanted to see how each muscle would move, even the slightest movements. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions, and then compare the results to everyone else, which would look kind of creepy on a wall now that I'm talking about it. It gets worse when you find out what the stimuli actually contained. I guess this guy wanted big reactions because he included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles and dangerous animals, and of course he exposed them to horrible things that I can't even talk about here on YouTube. Yeah, you can only imagine back in the day what the he saw. It was horrible. Yeah, horrible, right? That's a sad face. Big sad face in that one. Number 9, adhesive bras. Okay, we'll kick this list off with a sticky mess right off the hop. Back in 1949, Life magazine released an article that caught everybody's attention, obviously. May 16th, 1948, the article read, "For 5,000 years, clothes have been draped, tied, buttoned, pinned, and buckled on the human form." Now at this point, somebody walking by would go, "Oh, what's this about?" Then it continues. "This year, for the first time in history, they will be glued on." Yes, what in the world? How? How is that possible? One newspaper, please. Let's do it. Inventor Charles Langs, he changed the game in 1949. He made bra cups that would stick to you with adhesive. He was the OG who did this. Now, it didn't feel too good. Didn't quite work right off the bat, as most things do. The special glue, this adhesive, was promised to leave behind no residue. It was promised to be painless, yet at the same time, stay glued on, even if you were to jump into a pool from 10 feet high. That was the sell. Yeah, sounds kind of impossible, right? It was. For 8, the Detroit Ice Fountain. Located in Washington Boulevard, the Detroit Ice Fountain was obviously such a hazard. We can never do this again. This is horrible. You'll never see this. It was a spectacle, of course, but it was a hazard nonetheless. Back in the early 1900s, a fountain was the talk of the town during colder months. The water jets would run all year long. For some reason, no one wanted to shut those off. They just let them go. So in turn, this fountain would freeze and pile up, and then freeze and pile up, and so on and Danforth. Now eventually it reached up to 60 feet tall, made of pure ice, right there on Washington Boulevard. It was a tourist attraction at that point. This was so dangerous. Yeah, shifting ice, dangling 60 feet above your loved one. What could go wrong? I can only imagine. Just tons of ice cracking all around you. Families would just gather around. It was horrible. The tradition has now moved to Bell Island, so you can safely observe ice trees instead. A little bit nicer, yeah. Just not in the middle of the street anymore. Please? Thank you. Number 7, spin doctors. Oh, this is amazing. Remember when you were a kid and you'd spin around with your friends and make yourself dizzy and be like, oh my god, it's great. Or I guess if you're just doing that now, it's cool too, sure. If you're a weird adult. It's all fun and games until somebody passes out or hits their head, right? That's why we don't do it often. Well, back in the mid-19th century, this was how medical experts would put you to sleep. Yeah, more specifically, this is how they used to treat schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. They would just spin them and then see what happens. There was a whirling chair and a whirling bed, so you can pick your fate, I guess. A whirling bed, you ever lay down after a night out and you feel like your bed's spinning? It was that times 1,000, pretty much. They would spin these poor patients around until they blacked out, and the goal was to literally shuffle the contents of their brain around. That was their medical advice. Yeah, I'm glad we don't do that anymore. Imagine going into the hospital and being like, yeah, I got hit in hockey, my head kind of hurts a bit, I don't know. They're like, oh, no problem. Just get on this zipper here and just spin around for a hot minute. See how you feel. Number 6, animal droppings. Hey, got a sore throat? No sweat. Dog will fix that. Animal droppings being used in history for medicinal practice will always be hilarious. But it checks out, right? You have to look at the facts. Makes a lot more sense than spinning a guy until he's unconscious, that's for sure. Ancient Egyptian doctors, they would use donkey, gazelle, fly, and dog droppings to ward off bad spirits. Microflora was often found in these droppings, so the consensus was that these properties could include antibiotic substances as well. So poop was used for medicinal purposes as well in history. In 1957, a microbiologist, Stanley Falco, he began instructing folk to eat their own poop for medical reasons, which we here on Bumblebee actually disagree with. Don't do that. I'll tell you what you can do though, subscribe. That's much nicer. That has better results than eating your own. We don't want that. Number 5. Reindeer Pet. Okay, Olivia and I are talking about a dog, but a reindeer? Maybe. I'll try and convince her. June 1941, the Germans were attacking the Soviet Union. It was one of the biggest attacks in history, and Britain and US had to send weapons, supplies, anything really, just to keep them afloat. Just to keep them in the fight, okay? So they sent these supplies through the Arctic Circle, which was the only route. But of course, it was littered with U-boats. Now thankfully, the British HMS Trident was there to watch the waters, and in turn, the Soviets were able to fight on. So as a gift, as a thank you, the Soviets sent the captain of said Trident, the World War II submarine, they sent them a live reindeer. Here you go. Don't eat them, just enjoy them. Please, just enjoy the reindeer. The British had to accept because of course it was ill-mannered if they didn't. So yeah, they had to keep a 6-foot-tall, real-life, alive reindeer on a submarine. That's so stressful. She probably had a horrible time. Her name was Pollyanna, and they brought her on board through a torpedo tube. That was her little commute onto the thing. She was a crew member for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Talk about smell. That's gonna, PU. 6 weeks in there? Get out of here. She slept better than most, believe it or not. She shared a room in the captain's quarters. Again, imagine the smell. I'm just saying. Number 4, ice baths. We mentioned an ice fountain earlier, that was for sure a hazard, but let's talk about some old ice remedies. So if you saw somebody having an ice bath today, you wouldn't think anything of it, right? Maybe they just finished leg day and they're trying to reduce inflammation. Maybe they're trying to improve breathing, all that good stuff, you know? But back in the day, ice baths weren't just for athletes, right? They were meant for those who had rabies. Yeah, athletes and rabies, here you go, hop in. Rabies was of course a growing concern in Europe in the 1700s, so a treatment was to take 40 grains of ground liverwort, add some pepper, mix it up in milk, and then drink it, as well as having an ice bath. Both those things right there, there we go. Do that 4 times a day and rabies should be gone. Historically, it didn't happen, but that's what they wanted to happen. That's like a fear factor challenge. That's one of the worst things I've ever heard. Liver milk and a nice bath? Horrible. Happy Sunday, I guess. Number 3, tapeworms. Back in the Victorian times, they really figured out the trick to weight loss. Nice. Was it watching what you eat, counting your steps, maybe getting a gym membership at ye old gym? No, it was way easier than all those combined. And you didn't even have to pull back on what you ate. How great is that? All you needed was a handy tapeworm. Yeah, a little tapeworm inside you all the time. You know those things that can kill you if you get one today? Yeah, that was their plan back in the Victorian days. The plan was, if you eat a tapeworm egg, it will later hatch in your stomach, and at that point you could just eat anything you wanted, because every time you ate, the tapeworm, he would also eat. So you could get your snack on while still rocking those Victorian skinny jeans, know what I'm saying? Tapeworm cyst pills or the Stairmaster? I don't know, take your bets. He's like, I'm hungry. Number 2, smoking solutions. All right, don't smoke, don't do that. Here at Bumblebee, we say don't smoke. Back in 1665, during a plague in London, you were told to smoke cigarettes because they were considered disinfectants. This is wrong. This is, again, don't smoke. Yeah, sore throat, no problem. I'm sure this pack of darts will help. Here you go. We mentioned before tobacco smoke enemas, which is hilarious, but this is just bad advice all around. Since mouth to mouth wasn't a thing until the 50s, if you were trying to save a drowning victim, you would ideally blow smoke in their face or their butts. Either way, don't do it. It's insane. And then cut to 1964, it turns out smoking is bad for us. Yeah. What? Who knew? Who would have thought? Yeah, it's pretty intense now. The photos on cigarette packages, they're haunting to look at. Number 1. Ants, man. Okay, I'm totally gonna jinx myself for this, but I've never broken a bone or gotten stitches in my life. Knock on wood, knock on wood. Chris, have you? Bones or stitches?
Stitches, no.
Bone yes, stitches no. Okay. Comment down below. Bone yes, stitches no. That's gonna be a weird comment section, but I'm here for it. Many of my friends have gotten stitches in their life. It's obviously pretty common, so I figured I'd cap this list off going back to the origins of stitches because it sounds very painful and it's impressive. Going back to 3000 BC, once again, Egyptian literature, this is where you could find this. Stitches were first made from plants like hemp or cotton or animal tendons, animal arteries, you name it. Catgut was common. That was thread made out of sheep intestines. That's a fun one to get right there. That's probably smelly. One of the craziest ways, though, of closing a wound was by using ants. Real life ants, believe it or not. Leafcutter ants, or army ants, they would be held against the opening of your wound, and you'd wait down for it to bite. Now, once the ant bit, you would cut its head off so that the head of the ant was still stuck biting onto your wound, staying there ideally until the wound heals up. Yeah, imagine Ant-Man shows up to save the day and he just shows a pocket full of army ants. Not what I expected at all, but still helps me. Thank you so much, Ant-Man, you're the best. Please send somebody else next time. Awesome, this is so itchy.